Well, the state of New York, the governor, Andy Cuomo, who's up for re-election as governor, is revealing to the world their plans to clean up the giant algae blooms on Lake Champlain caused by the algae blooms on Lake George, caused by all the sewage and the industrial slop and the chemicals and the toxins and the poisons being flushed over from the mill pond, Lake George. The history, the true, actual, factual history of using the Dam A at Ticonderoga up at Weedville to flush all these chemicals and all this sewage and leachate and the mess from the brownfields around Lake George. There's approximately 12 to 15,000 septic systems and leach fields that drain into Lake George and have been doing so for many decades. The fake Lake George history is the topic of this video. The fake news, if you will, of the deep state there in Warren County, New York. The deep state there in Queensbury, New York, and Lake George and Bolton Landing and over on the east side of Lake George around Assembly Point and Cleverdale and Pilot Knob and Dunham's Bay and Harris Bay and Catskill Bay. And of course all the way up to Hewlett's Landing. Now I want to get down here to some basics. The proving of the facts, which, trust me, I'm very familiar with facts and scientific records and things like scientific evidence. The forensic evidence that's associated with what the Glens Falls Post-Star and Channel 6 and Channel 10 and all the other news in the area, including the Troy Record and the Albany Times-Union and the Burlington Free Press. The reality of all this sewage being flushed down the Poop Chute. The Poop Chute River, more commonly known as Ticonderoga Creek, also known as the La Chute River, the La Poop Chute River, that flushes all this garbage, sewage, chemicals, industrial slop, industrial waste, mercury, dioxins, just every imaginable type of carcinogen, flushed and dumped en masse. Just gargantuan amounts of this slop has been flushed right in front of Fort Ticonderoga. And this is for the Board of Supervisors for Warren County and for Washington County, Essex County, New York, and of course the governor of the state and the Department of Environmental Conservation for the state of Vermont and the state of New York. Well, just the other day, it's a continuing flushing. They've been flushing this garbage daily for decades on Lake George over into Lake Champlain. Well, again the other day, 16,500 gallons is flushed from the sewers of Ticonderoga into Lake Champlain. But of course the news claims that it was flushed into the Poop Chute River, which, you know, dumps right there into Lake Champlain. So all of this sewage was dumped into Lake Champlain, which brings me again to the fake Lake George history. All of this flushing of all of this sewage and all of these chemicals from Lake George to Lake Champlain using the flusher works the big giant toilet flusher known as Dam A, dam number 230 at Ticonderoga, as a matter of scientific evidence. The historical record absolutely proves the fact that this giant flushing has been part of a dilution is the solution to pollution policy, practice, and custom of the state of New York, Warren County, and Queensbury, New York. This one's going directly to Queensbury. All along the northern section of Queensbury, New York at Lake George, that entire area has been flooded artificially because of the raising of the lake level by the installation and the operation of Dam A, Dam 230. The marshes, the swamp, along the northern end of Queensbury is mostly man-made swamp and man-made marshes because of this big flushing apparatus that was installed by Judge Isaac Kellogg, and then a series of subsequent owners who came along later and rebuilt the dam and made it bigger and allowed it to be used to power and to provide water to the International Paper and Power. Don't forget that. Power. International Paper and Power Corporation. They've been continually, for decades, day after day after day after day, furthering and continuing to perpetrate a continuing public nuisance of dumping all this sewage continually into Lake Champlain. Now, the reason I keep pointing out the continually is because the statute of limitations are renewed every day that this continuing flushing operation continues. Now, here's a little wrinkle. Here's some scientific evidence, and then of course you've got the proof. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers of the United States government, and the United States Geological Service, the United States Coast Guard, the United States Department of the Interior, the U.S. Supreme Court, lawyers by the dozens for New York State and Vermont, and the courts of Vermont, the courts of New York, and the courts of the United States are all very familiar with this story. Particularly the Fourth Circuit Court in Raleigh, North Carolina. Judge Bowles, I guess his name is, down here. The appellate court for the Fourth Circuit of the United States in Richmond, Virginia, and of course, and not leastly and certainly lastly, the Supreme Court of the United States is extremely familiar with this continuing flushing operation that's been going on for about 160, 70 years now. But to the point, Dam A, the release mechanisms known as the spillway and the release gates. The spillway and the release gates have been inspected and analyzed and evaluated by Stetson Engineering, who was hired by the state of New York to inspect the dam for dam safety purposes. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers inspected it and diagrammed it and researched it and have determined that the flusher that lets all the water out of the lake, when they flush all the water from the lake, the toilet, the mill pond, when they flush the mill pond, the spillway is 54% too small. In other words, it's not large enough to control flood stages are what's known as probable flood moments on Lake George. And they determined the dam to be a high-risk dam and unsafe. And this was in 1980, some 6 years after the state of New York was given for free that dam by International Paper Corporation and Power. They not only gave them the dam for free, but they gave them $150,000 to upgrade and improve the dam in 1974. So International Paper and Power and the state of New York knew damn well that prior to 1974, they know damn well that prior to 1974, this dam has been a disaster and a public nuisance and a joke. Now there's a ranger who's now no longer amongst the living. He passed away. That worked for 40 years for the Lake George Park Commission. He worked 40 years for environmental conservation as a ranger on Lake George. Frank Leonbruno. And Frank Leonbruno and people like Ellen Apperson Brown and the Union College and the State University of New York and the Adirondack Museum, let's not leave them out, the Adirondack Almanac, the Lake George Mirror, the Lake George Warrensburg News, the Glens Falls Post-Star, and just a list of witnesses that are staggering. Know that every time they flush that lake, they like to do it in the winter time when they can make a lot of money generating power for International Paper and Power Corporation. They convert all that water into horsepower to make large amounts of electricity for their paper making mills. International Power and Paper made huge amounts of money with their own electrical generation company using the flusher works to let all this water out of Lake George during the wintertime drawdown. Now, according to David Wick, the Lake George Park Commission, Roger Smith, and the state of New York, the reason they have to draw the lake down in the wintertime, the reason they have to release all that water in the winter, is because the spillway and the release mechanisms are like draining Lake George through a pinhole. So when they flush the lake of all this sewage leachate and the chemicals, and they flush the Poop Chute River and all the millions of cubic yards, approximately 800 tons every day for decades were flushed into the front of Fort Ticonderoga, Mount Defiance, Mount Independence. They're on South Bay at Lake Champlain. Now today, we're sanitizing the official record. We're trying to clean it up. We're trying to wipe it clean and alter the history by separating all these issues. Because we don't want International Paper and Power and the financial interests behind them, the Glens Falls Banks, Arrow Financial, First National, Glens Falls National Banks, and the banks in Ticonderoga and in Lake George. We do not want the connections made of the money, the vast amounts of money that have been made for decades flushing all of this sewage into Lake Champlain. And this is going to Ken Tingsley, the grand poobah there at the Glens Falls Post-Star. Ken Tingsley and all the newspaper reporters with the Glens Falls Post-Star, John Warren, Bill Hall at the Lake George Mirror, all of the people that have been tracking this official government record know that the Witham family had their marina docks destroyed many times by the destruction caused by this damn 230. Damn A. Now, the historical records of the state of New York reveal that the state of New York itself complained about the massive man-made flooding of northern Queensbury. And that's going to Carol Barber, the clerk for Queensbury, New York, and to Kathy Bozzoni, who's working on sewage infrastructure and sewage upgrades with the Fund for Lake George, Tom West, Chris Nowinski, RPI University, and the Darren Freshwater Institute. All of these people are aware of this historical reality of the great big toilet flusher on the great big toilet basin lake, the mill pond known as Lake George. Now we're in August the 10th or so, I guess, or August, yeah, it's about August the 10th, 2018, and they're still flushing the Poop Chute River using Lake George as a toilet reservoir. The mill pond is just like that tank on the back of your toilet. It's used to flush all this slop over to Lake Champlain, which is a bloomin' nightmare. Lake Champlain is the color of this book. The algae blooms on Lake George are disgusting, beyond belief. And Andy Cuomo and Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders and the Clintons, the legislatures for Vermont, the legislatures for New York, are fully aware of what I just said in this entire video. President Donald Trump, Vice President Pence, Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, and Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States. I challenge anybody in the world to discuss this actual historical reality with me, Clifford and Anita Witham's son. And that includes Billy Mason, Richard Mason, John Mason, Bobby Mason, the Meade family, the McLaughlins, the Muratories, the Mannixes, John Stowe, or however you say it, John Stowe, the grand wizard and poobah there of the town of Queensbury, New York. Let's talk about the actual real history of George Stewart's employers, George Stewart, Robert Stewart's father, and Richard Bartlett's clients. Richard Bartlett and Robert Stewart of the Harris Bay Development Company were part of this gang that flushed the lake. They flush all the sewage out of Lake George. And Lindy Owen and Robert Owen, the big real estate guy there from the Glens Falls National Bank. Hi, Lindy. Her maiden name was Lindy Harridan. And for quite a while she was married to Teddy Hands, old Ted Hands. Hi, Teddy Hands. These are all friends of mine from up on Cleverdale. The scientific evidence reveals, and the proof shows, that the legislative and the judicial records, the court records of the state of New York, absolutely corroborate and support this fact. The up and down water during the winter time destroyed a lot of docks, a lot of islands, and a lot of shoreline and boathouses. And the Witham Marina was destroyed many times in a row. And that's going to Judge Boyle down in Raleigh, North Carolina. Judge Boyle and the appellate court in Richmond, Virginia, and to the justices of the United States Supreme Court to the executive offices of the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and Jeff Sessions and Christopher Wray, Director of FBI. The actual, truthful, accurate, factual historical record of Dam A at Weedville, there at Weedville, Joseph Weed, Alonzo Baldwin, the two fellows that got criminally indicted for flooding northern Queensbury. Carroll Barber, the only place at Lake George that would have been massively flooded by Isaac Kellogg's dam, and Alonzo Baldwin and Joseph Weed and the Lake George Steamship Company. Oh, he said the Lake George Steamship Company. And the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, with this up and down, up and down, up and down water, would be the marshes, the swamps on Lake George in northern Queensbury. That's for Carroll Barber, the clerk of Queensbury, New York. And to the publishing staff and, you know, the reporters from the Glens Falls Post-Star and the Lake George Mirror. And the Adirondacker and the, the Adirondack Almanac and all those glossy Adirondack tourist magazines. And the Albany Times-Union, Troy Record, and all the TV stations in New York. The scientific evidence, and this is where I'm going to close this video. I'm getting long here. The scientific evidence reveals that the Attorney General and the District Attorney for Warren County, New York, the Attorney General's office for the state of New York, the state legislature, and one of my greatest witnesses, I suppose, would be Ellen Apperson Brown and Chris Nowinski. They're at the Darren Freshwater Institute in Bolton Landing. The historical record, the accurate historical record reveals that this continuing public nuisance of the up and down water draining the bathtub through the pinhole, the 54% too small spillways, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of the Interior, U.S. Coast Guard, United States Geological Service. The up and down water flusher, the big toilet flusher at Ticonderoga, destroyed Clifford and Anita Withams Marina year after year after year after year after year after year. And Frank Liambruno and Irving Langmuir and John Apperson and a whole lot of other people, Glens Falls Post-Star, are witnesses to this continuing daily flushing of the vastly polluted and contaminated waters from Lake George, New York, the big toilet bowl, over to Lake Champlain. Folks, they cannot wipe away this record. They can't alter the historical facts. And all of their records under Freedom of Information Law and the Freedom of Information Act have been demanded in writing many times to the state of New York, and the silence is deafening. Crickets. They refuse, they dishonor, and will not obey the open records laws of the state of New York, and many of them are just flat out lying about it. They're liars. Donald J. Trump, imagine that, liars. And the last thing I'm going to say is, you know, they tried to wipe my mother and father from the historical chronicles of Lake George. Not only did they screw them over royally and wipe them out completely many times, they went on to destroy their names and their characters, and then, of course, they wrote them out of history like they never existed. I am the unwanted bastard child of Lake George, New York, and ladies and gentlemen, I ain't going away. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, hasta la vista, God bless, and you betcha we're coming back.